All right, good morning and good early afternoon, everybody. Hope you all can hear me. Sarah, are you online? Can you hear me?
Yep, you're good.
All right. Good afternoon, and thanks for joining this webinar. We are very excited to have three expert speakers here today talking about local data and tools for advocacy at the local level in Massachusetts to ensure an equitable cannabis industry. So my name is Dr. Marion McNabb, and I'm the CEO of Cannabis Community Care and Research Network. We are excited to be here today with our colleagues from the Massachusetts Recreational Consumer Council and the Cannabis Control Commission, and colleagues from Rutgers University to conduct a webinar. So we will go through some slides and a toolkit for about the first hour, and then we'll turn over to question and answer from the audience. So there's a chat box you can see in the GoToMeeting. So if you have a question throughout the webinar, please just go ahead and put it in the chat box, and we will monitor and try and get those questions answered. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the speakers for this webinar, and thank you all for joining. So the title is Data and Tools to Advocate for Equity at the Local Level in Massachusetts. And we're very honored to have three speakers today. The first is Cannabis Control Commissioner Shalene Title. Shalene Title was appointed by the Governor, Treasurer, and Attorney General of Massachusetts to lead the agency tasked with implementing cannabis law, along with four other commissioners in September of 2017. Title previously helped connect marijuana businesses with employees as a co-founding partner of THC Staffing Group, an inclusion-focused marijuana industry recruiting firm. Shalene is also an attorney specializing in marijuana regulations and helped draft the marijuana laws and provided regulatory expertise for leading consulting firms, including Vincente Cederberg and Forefront Advisors. Title won several awards for her advocacy work and efforts to bring more women and people of color into drug policy reform, including the Hunter S. Thompson Young Attorney Award and the High Times Freedom Fighter Award. Shalene is a trustee of Students for Sensible Drug Policy and a founding board member of the Minority Cannabis Business Association and Marijuana Majority. So we thank you, Shalene, for being here. Our second panelist is Kamani Jefferson. Kamani Jefferson is the president of the Massachusetts Recreational Consumer Council. He graduated with a degree in Management Information Systems from Binghamton University and developed sales and technology experience from Silicon Valley before co-founding the Cannabis Cultural Association out of New York. In 2016, Kamani relocated to Boston to support the campaign to regulate marijuana-like alcohol, question 4, and also volunteering for Students for Sensible Drug Policy and the Massachusetts Patient Advocacy Alliance. As a registered lobbyist and president of the Massachusetts Recreational Consumer Council, Kamani is a very active local constituent in the cannabis industry. And last but not least, our third presenter today is Sarah Trocchio. Sarah Trocchio is a PhD candidate in criminal justice at Rutgers University in Newark and a racial equity scholar and advocate who focuses on drug policy. She received her master's in social work from Boston University and a master's in arts and criminal justice from Rutgers University in 2013. Sarah is widely published and has presented widely in the fields of social work and criminal justice in the peer-reviewed literature, and currently serves as adjunct instructor at Simmons College of Social Work, where she teaches advocacy and social action to graduate students. So thank you all for being here today, and I'll hand it over to Sarah to start us off. Can you hear you, Sarah?
I can hear you. All right, next slide, please. Welcome all, and thank you, as Marion said, for joining us this afternoon for what I hope is a robust and important dialogue. Today, this is what we have before us as an agenda. Well, first, we already did some introductions. We'll get into some background, then talk a little bit about the state level context and the importance of local settings. before we dive in deeply into offering you some hopefully very helpful tips and tricks of the trade that you might be able to use in your own advocacy toolkit. So as we get started this afternoon, I want to offer you a bit of grounding context about the current landscape of legalization. In policy advocacy speak, we often say that the most impactful writing of policy doesn't actually come when you draft a specific ballot initiative, for example, but it comes in a myriad of regulations that fundamentally shape the way that that law will be implemented. As former Governor DePaul Patrick once said, when there is a change of guards, you must guard the change. But what exactly does this mean as we enter into the new landscape that we found ourselves in terms of legalization? And what is to be gained and what is to be lost if we don't guard the change? This is where the story of whether or not a policy is actually successful plays out. And by success, we're not just talking about gains or losses in a wholly macro sense, but we're also talking about intended and also unintended consequences on varied populations and stakeholders. So in Massachusetts and other states where cannabis has become legal, considerations as to how to translate that written policy into actual programs are being made right now. And as early lessons point out, there is some tension and ambivalence across localities about what will actually happen on the ground in terms of cannabis legalization, and in turn, what the lasting impacts and legacy of cannabis legalization in this state will be. So ultimately, we're now at the front lines of determining whether or not cannabis legalization is going to be considered good policy or not in the history books. So our goal throughout this webinar is to arm you with a bit of information as to why and how cannabis legalization must and should be considered not just an opportunity for economic growth, but fundamentally as something that must be geared and focused on equity. All right, Marian, thank you. Next. So we'll dig a little bit more about what we mean by equity a little bit later in the presentation, but for now I just want to provide a bit more grounding context as to why it's so imperative that we keep social justice front and center as we move forward with legalization. So as you're likely familiar, the policy landscape pertaining to cannabis has been particularly, can you go back, Marian? Particularly bleak for some time. And there have been wholly punitive responses to the use of the drug until very, very recently. And so as you can see in this figure, the mere size of the criminal justice response to cannabis has been incredible. But when you peel back the layers a bit more and you consider who have been the most frequent targets of this criminal justice response, it becomes clear that the war on drugs was in many ways a war that was nearly exclusively waged against individuals and communities of color. As Darlene Flynn, Oakland, California's Department of Race and Equity Department noted, the war on drugs was the war on a very specific community and a very specific culture. But what exactly is meant by this? Well, a few things. Namely that deeply entrenched stratification patterns due to our unique racial history, including segregation and slavery, have made it more likely in general that Black and brown people will be likely to come in contact with the police and endure all of the consequences of that contact. Relatedly, neighborhoods and people of color were much more likely to be surveilled, to be arrested, to be charged, to be convicted and sentenced for cannabis crimes at the height of the war on drugs. And this is important, even when those offenses were nonviolent and even when those offenses were minor. And there's a lot of theories out there in criminal justice as to why this later phenomenon happened, but a pretty significant line of research in the field points to the idea that there are more and less implicit biases racially that have been driven in part by racialized stereotypes, and these have contributed, at least in part, to the creation and the maintenance of punitive drug laws, and led them to more frequently target Black and brown folks. Next slide. So people generally understand that the war on drugs and cannabis started at the end of the 1970s. This is when we had the Reagan administration and the Just Say No to Drugs campaign. And that was a national trend that happened to also coincide with a lot of patterns in the state. So in Massachusetts, as we saw starting in the 1970s, we had what was known as full criminalization. So the idea that any possession for any reason, as well as any cultivation and sales, were illegal and punishable criminally. And boy, were they punished criminally. And this is where in 2009, however, we start to see some divergence from national trends and state trends, as you're likely familiar. By 2009, Massachusetts passed decriminalization, which created civil penalties for small possession amounts. Cultivation, sale, and possession of more than 1 ounce were still illegal, though. And then in 2012, we had medicalization, in which medical marijuana was passed as legal. And starting in 2014, there was a huge uptick in license applications for medical marijuana. And by that year, there was also a huge decrease in marijuana-related arrests. And then we get to 2016, where the ballot initiative to legalize and regulate cannabis as if it were alcohol were passed. But as I alluded to earlier, the future is yet to be written in this way. Next slide. So a really important consideration when we're thinking about cannabis legalization is understanding disparities and having a clear sense of what disparities are and what they are not. So a really important designation is that disparities do not equal discrimination. Discrimination is based on prejudicial treatment that is based on group membership, whereas disparities are based on disproportionate representation relative to the population size and behavior patterns of a group. So when we're talking about disparities, it is not necessarily the root causes that matter the most, it is the effect that matters the most. So we want to keep that in mind. I want to point you to the figures that are on your right, those pie charts, but I do want to provide a brief little note here. In the next few slides, I'm talking about Blacks versus others, or Blacks versus whites, and that's because the legacy of disparities research has largely focused on Blacks and compared them to whites, and only more recently and accurately included Latinos and other people of color. It's also worth noting that the disparities between Blacks and whites have been the most pronounced, so those are often used in the literature. That is not to say that other groups that have been disproportionately impacted by the drug war, such as Latinos, are not subject to some of these similar trends. But now that we're in the legalization context of cannabis, one might be tempted to suggest that we're all in the clear in terms of the risk of continuing unjust historical patterns racially. But as you can see from this recent data on your right, the proportion of Blacks that were arrested for marijuana possession in 2016 far outpaced the proportional representation of Blacks in the state population. So Blacks only constitute 24%. Excuse me, I will just tell you really quickly, this slide is swapped, so I don't want you to get confused. The Massachusetts population of Blacks is actually 7%, whereas the number of marijuana arrests was actually 24%. So apologies, if you're following along, please make a note that the disproportionate representation, which is higher, is for arrests rather than population. So one might be tempted to look at this and say, okay, well, 24% of marijuana arrests were for Black folks, and only 7% of the overall state population is Black in Massachusetts. But that's not really a problem if Black folks are actually using marijuana and selling marijuana at greater rates than whites or other folks are. But that is not the case, and that is what cuts at the heart of how we define disparities. Disparities are disproportionate representation relative to population and behavior patterns. Next slide, please. So if the ratio of disparities had decreased substantially over time, we could say that things were looking pretty promising in Massachusetts in the context of legalization. But as this chart unfortunately demonstrates, disparities and the ratio of disparities remain substantial. So remember from the prior slide that we don't want to just look at how high each of these bars goes to assess the extent of a disparity problem, but we want to be looking at the gap between the yellow and the green bars. So if you were to do that, you would find that while the overall marijuana arrests for each group have plummeted over time, especially as they relate to possession, we're not seeing a change in the actual Black to white ratio in arrests. So what you would see if you looked at each of these figures on the graph is that the ratio of Black to white arrests in Massachusetts from 2008 to 2016 remains pretty steady at 4-to-1. So that means that even as recently as 2016, right as legalization was passing, Blacks were still 4 times as likely to be arrested for cannabis-related offenses than whites. That's a problem. That's a really big problem when we consider that overall marijuana arrests reduced like 83% since decriminalization, and possession arrests in particular decreased nearly 85% in that time. Next slide. And so this is especially a really large problem when we look at the market projections for Massachusetts for the cannabis industry in the context of legalization. So just in 2016, when we had medicalization and decriminalization, the Massachusetts industry was 50.2 million, and that was just with medical marijuana. When recreational cannabis is added, that number is expected to balloon to 1 billion by 2020. So we're not talking 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 years. We're talking about a matter of a few years. And about 60% of all national growth in the marijuana industry by 2021 is expected to come from 6 states alone, and those 6 states include Massachusetts. Next slide. So given all this information that I just shared, it's not incredibly surprising that whites, and white men in particular, I will note, currently monopolize the lion's share of the cannabis industry. So this data is from 2017, but as you can see, business owners are incredibly white. What I want to stress to you is that each and every one of you has the power to start shifting some of these figures, but it's not going to happen without really intentional effort. In fact, I believe that not doing anything is pretty paramount to creating harm. And that's because if we don't do anything, there is very, very good reason to believe that the people of color in cannabis industry will inherit the disadvantage that they faced in the drug war itself. Now I want to show you an image. Marion, if you don't mind clicking on that so it flies in. And so as you can see from this graphic from the Equity Office in San Francisco, this disadvantage in the market shows up across a host of categories, including financial, technical, and criminal. And so I am not exaggerating when I say that the legacy of legal pot as yet another device of racial injustice is all but guaranteed if we do not fight to ensure that in our state, cannabis policy intentionally seeks to mitigate these barriers. Next slide. So I'm now going to hand over the presentation to Shalene for a few minutes, who's going to talk about what's happening on the ground at the CCC.
Thank you, Sarah. So if you want proof of how well grassroots advocacy works, you don't need to look any farther than the state law. I was one of the original authors of Question 4, the legalization ballot question in Massachusetts, and it had an unprecedented mandate that the legal marijuana program would promote the inclusion of people from disproportionately impacted communities. That law was rewritten by the legislature last summer, and for a while, based on the House bill, it looked like it was going to roll back the equity provision, add in a bunch of exclusions, and generally make it less friendly to social justice. However, the community came out to demonstrations, press conferences, impromptu lobby day, called, emailed, Facebook, Instagram, told people to call their legislators. We found champion elected officials who are willing to speak out on this. And I will openly admit that by the end of the process, we ended up with a bill that was unequivocally better than the question that we started out with. The final law not only kept the equity provision in place, but it strengthened it considerably. And it also made the Cannabis Control Commission an independent agency with 5 people with 5 different areas of expertise, including on social justice, which is the seat that I now hold. So let me briefly tell you about what's been done at the state level to include marginalized communities. We wanted to ensure, both because it's the right thing to do and because it's required by law, that the industry we regulate is diverse and fair, with ample room for businesses of all sizes to thrive and contribute. I will note here that before we started the regulations, we held a listening tour last fall all over the state. And a big reason why we implemented these provisions is because we heard over and over again that people wanted equitable policies, again showing the importance of advocacy and public input and the power of being able to speak up and use your voice as a citizen. So first, there are no caps on licenses at the state level. My personal experience over the years in so many different states, so many different legal marijuana programs, has been that a cap is bad for equity. It pits otherwise well-intentioned entrepreneurs against each other. It incentivizes bad behavior, and nobody should be referring to licenses as golden tickets. When you set up a system like that, then any equity program is akin to a cosmetic diversity plan that you just throw on top of a system of inequity. It has to be fair to begin with. So in Massachusetts, we decided that the state would set no cap and instead simply deem applicants suitable or unsuitable. However, of course, cities and towns can set caps on the number of licenses, and that is one of the subjects of this webinar that we'll come back to. So trying to encourage businesses of all sizes, our commission decided not to mandate that applicants raise a certain amount of capital. They have to demonstrate that they have capital, but there's no numerical number. There's no number of dollar amount. There's also application fees that are very low. They range from $100 to $600 depending on the type, and background checks, and that's it. We just charged what will be charged to us, what it will cost us, and sometimes even lower than that. In addition to the explicit statutory requirements, we recognize that it's 2018 and there is an obvious necessity and great benefit to including people of color, women, veterans, small farmers, the LGBT community, and individuals with disabilities in different types of businesses. And so we require that all applicants submit and adhere to a diversity plan. We also created a kind of extra credit program to reward applicants who want to go above and beyond. So companies that donate 1% of their revenue to our technical assistance fund for our equity program can put a special social justice leader on their packaging as a signal to conscious consumers who want to support businesses that share their values. We also wanted to encourage innovation and creativity, and so we require all applicants to submit a plan for how the business will positively affect communities disproportionately impacted by drug prohibition. If you look at the headlines in Massachusetts, you'll see that there are already applicants experimenting with incubators, career fairs, skills trainings, and other types of innovative plans. And then lastly, we created a variety of pathways for different businesses of different sizes to succeed. We created licenses for micro businesses, which allow small businesses to cultivate and manufacture under one license that is deeply discounted. We also created co-ops to allow small farmers to pool their resources across multiple locations. And we waived the monthly service fees for software for these applicants as well as equity applicants. Now, in addition to these general measures, we have two major highly targeted programs that are both required under state law. So on the next slide here, these are the two sections from Chapter 55 of the Acts of 2017 that form the basis for these programs. The first section, and if you look at the bolded text, you'll see that they are both meant to support these disproportionately harmed communities, but in different ways. So the first provides programs to assist the applicants from those communities. That'll be launched this summer. And specifically, it provides various benefits, including technical assistance to applicants and operators who are from disproportionately harmed communities or who have drug convictions or whose parent or spouse has a drug conviction. Now, the second program is to prioritize the applications of people who promote economic empowerment in those communities. That process, because it was about priority and speed, has closed, and we have 123 applicants certified with priority status under this program. So that's the state program for context. Now, moving on to local context, I'm going to very briefly give an overview of local control under Massachusetts legal marijuana, but the bulk of this webinar is going to be focused on the advocacy toolkit. So if you want a more expansive summary on local control, I encourage you to go to masscannabiscontrol.com, click on Guidance Documents, and click on Guidance for Municipalities, and you will see a much more thorough summary of everything I'm about to go over. So under the law, applicants need local approval before they can be approved at the state level. So they need both. They have to get approval from their city or town where they'll be located, and then they can apply to the state and go through the state licensing process. Cities and towns may pass bans in certain circumstances, which is that if the municipality voted no on question 4, then they can ban marijuana establishments by passing a bylaw or ordinance before December 31st, 2019. If the municipality voted yes for legalization on question 4, then they can pass a bylaw or ordinance instituting a cap on the number of licenses to 20% or more of the number of liquor package stores in that municipality. Or they can ban through a referendum if they put the question to the people and they vote that they want to ban. Cities and towns can also pass a moratorium, but that can only be used as a temporary measure while the city or town decides on how it wants to zone and institute this local control process. It can't be used as an indefinite ban. Similarly, zoning can't be used to be so restrictive that it's used to get around the rules and create a ban or a limit under that 20%. But it's still legally permitted for zoning to be pretty restrictive. And so I think that's where it's often fair for stakeholders to point out that where maybe this hasn't been thought of during the process or brought up, that restrictive zoning can be a barrier to entry. If it's so limited that only a few buildings are in the permitted zones, you can see how that could turn into a bidding war and be a barrier to entry. So basically, where there is no ban, an applicant needs to find a location that fits within the allowed zoning, and then they need to negotiate and sign a contract with the community called a host community agreement, and then apply at the state level. So here at the Cannabis Control Commission, we have gotten a lot of inquiries from cities and towns saying that they want to do this right and thoughtfully in a way that reflects their local values, and they are seeking guidance of people with expertise on this issue. This means to me that there is an extraordinary opportunity for local civic engagement, particularly for someone who has read that guidance, knows the rules, and has taken the time to watch this webinar and learn more about this issue and how to advocate at the local level. The last item that I want to mention, because it is not talked about enough, in my opinion, is that under state law, the Cannabis Control Commission is required to collect data to grade ourselves on providing opportunities for participation in the legal industry. And if we don't do so well, to take remedial measures. The way that I read this, and you can see the language here on the slide, is that the law requires the state to do whatever it takes to create meaningful participation of different communities in the industry. And personally, I would rather do this right the first time than to be forced to do it through remedial measures. And that's something that I think every level of government should keep in mind. As of today, we only have one data point and it's early, but the data point is that out of 123 econ empowerment applicants certified for priority review, only 3 have submitted applications. So we will be keeping a close eye on that and asking questions and taking action as appropriate. Before I turn it over to our experts in advocacy, one last note. This is a very timely issue, and it's being addressed by all different types of businesses and communities and governments every day. There are local hearings coming up on specifically this issue. There are some organizations working on model ordinances. There's a lot going on, so if you want to stay on top of this, I encourage you to follow me on Twitter at Shalene Title, and I will make sure to send out tweets as this continues to develop every day. And so with that, I will turn it over to Kamani Jefferson and back to Sarah Trocchio to take you through the advocacy toolkit.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Commissioner Title, and thank you for everything in terms of just advocating for equity. It's very helpful to see someone at the commission level doing that. So thank you again.
Everyone on the commission.
Everyone.
Yes, thank you. So now that we have a bit more context, we want to dive into a little bit more about what each and every one of you can do to make sure that the important work of the CCC is actually realized at your local level. Next slide. So in order to do that, I want to just quickly read this quote, which is, I think, a helpful quote from one of the social work textbooks that I use in my adjuncting capacity. So what is advocacy? What is it that we're talking about when we're talking about the need to advocate? Advocacy is a practice that takes action in a systematic and purposeful way to defend, represent, or otherwise advance the cause of one or more clients at the individual group, organization, or community level in order to promote social justice. The usual targets of advocacy practice are the decision makers in elected or appointed positions who not only create, but also legitimize laws, regulations, rules, and other types of policies. So you might be wondering, despite all that Shalene shared with us, can you really have an impact? And the answer is unequivocally yes. Yes, you can. Shalene and Kamani have spoken and will speak about the great influence that residents joining together to make their voices heard have had on the shape of the state law, and also will continue to have on structuring the important provisions that exist in localities. And so why does local advocacy matter? Why can't we just say, okay, we passed the ballot initiative, that's great, and we're done? Well, for the host of reasons that Shalene shared, as well as a number of reasons that are elucidated in research that I work on. So one being that policy implementation is an incredibly localized process. So we have what's known as sort of the laws on the books. So the main provisions that are provided as policy when drafted at the state level. But then we have a lot of different iterations that law can take once it's practiced on the street. Research also indicates that elected officials in local contexts, so in cities and towns, are actually the most receptive to constituent demand. So that's relative to state level legislators and also the federal government. And so citizens in local contexts are incredibly influential in determining whether those elected officials will support specific initiatives. That's because local governance is designed to be a highly participatory process, and just because of the proximity that residents have to their elected officials. And furthermore, state law allows localities to establish local ordinances and licensing regulations in cannabis, so long as that municipal legislation is not unreasonably impractical. So the takeaway point here is, so long as you can demonstrate effectively that what you're asking for is practical and doable, you have a real shot at making a real impact. Next slide. So as we have foreshadowed, not that implicitly, we believe that a key goal of local advocacy in the cannabis industry should be advancing equity. And I want to pause for a moment to make a distinction that I think is important and sometimes gets lost in a lot of these policy discussions. And I think it's nicely represented in this graphic. So equality and equity are not the same thing. Equality, if you want to look at equality is about sameness. So it's about giving everyone access to the same resource or resource. So a key example of that would be universal health care, right? Everybody gets the same health care regardless of what their stature is in life. So as you can see on the figure on the left, everyone's getting the same support to be able to see the proverbial game. Equity, however, is about fairness. So equity is based on the principle that since everyone in society does not start from the same place, can you go back? Those that are disadvantaged require more resources than those that are more well-positioned, okay? So this, in our graphic, we see the little child who's too short to see over the fence. He's getting 2 boxes to stand up upon to view the game, rather than the taller guy on the left who doesn't need any help. So a sort of additional policy example for that would be loan forgiveness for public service occupations, right? The idea being that if you're a public interest lawyer and you're serving as a public defender for indigent clients, that you should be able to get a little bit of financial assistance in paying back your loans compared to an attorney, for example, that were to work at a really profitable firm. Okay, next slide. And so this is important, and I want you all to take away from this webinar with this key distinction and understanding that equity is not about risk and opportunity being equally distributed. It is about it being fairly distributed. Next slide. And so what gets a little murky about this is that what it means to be fair isn't always agreed upon. And as we've seen in some early examples coming out of Massachusetts and also in California where legalization has occurred, there are some substantial differences in the way that localities have begun to respond to the industry and what parameters they consider to be fair or not. So this is taken from an article from the New York Times comparing the very different ways on the sum total that Oakland, California and Compton, California have responded to legalization and have responded to trying to be inclusive about providing opportunities in disadvantaged communities for industry to thrive. So on the left, you have sort of a classic example embracing the core tenets of equity in a pretty textbook way. So Mr. McCullough, the Oakland resident who received a marijuana license in January, he has no ambivalence. He was one of the 4 so-called equity candidates chosen by lottery from a pool of dozens of residents who applied for a license to sell cannabis. If you look at the numbers, he said, we're definitely more targeted than any other race, and Mr. McCullough, who is Black, the city is helping us to fight back. But the example on the right shows you an example of the way that Compton, California has responded, and that's been quite different. And so it's important to remember that sometimes barriers to entry are not always external, they can also be internal, and they can also come from very real and very rational fear that has accompanied communities as they've been ravaged by the drug war and also ravaged by the stereotype stigma and detrimental impacts that they have faced as a result. And it's really important that we're aware of that and we're thoughtful about that as we move forward with advocacy. So the example says that we've been waiting so hard trying to change the image of Compton, said Reverend Stanley W. Prince, a leader of the No campaign that was victorious in a January vote. There is an economy that could be developed without having weed as the main product. So in Compton, they actually successfully banned establishments and licenses there. So it's important to really consider that when we're talking about what it means to be equitable, when we're talking about what it means to be fair, in my opinion, we must always not just consider what we're trying to do or what cities are trying to do for access, but we must fundamentally also be concerned about mitigating and working really intentionally to address and to fix the stigma and stereotype of weed in these communities. Next slide. So once you've got a handle on what you understand equity to be and what fairness is, as we're thinking about cannabis and also creating reparative or trying to create reparative policies in response to the drug war, once we do that, then we need to figure out, okay, what do we actually need to know to get some stuff done? And so I would say, as this quote says, after polishing up on their attitudes, if necessary, advocates need to be fully informed about the legislative process they wish to impact. The more advocates know about the process, the greater opportunity to influence the outcome. And so here are a few key terms that you might see or hear about or actually speak about as you're engaging in grassroots community organizing, which Shalene mentioned earlier. I'll spare you the cheeky joke about how I love grassroots community organizing when talking about the cannabis industry. But the important thing to note is that grassroots organizing is really based around 2 things. 1 being collective action and 2 being from the ground up. So grassroots community organizing is very much about residents taking initiative to target folks that are in power to make changes that they feel are reasonable, fair, and necessary in their communities. And I don't have time to go through all of these, but I do want to point out the example on the second bullet from the last, which talks about zoning and planning boards, which Shalene mentioned are important, and Kamani will speak about in just a few minutes. Okay, next slide. So this is just one of the few quick tools that we want to share to you while we have you captive as an audience. I'm not sure if you're familiar, but Facebook has recently launched what is called a town hall feature. And this can be really important because in order to learn about how you can impact change, one really important thing is to find out who represents you. And that's because in this wonderful thing called a participatory democracy. Even though you might be targeting whole bodies, for example, a city council, you technically employ your specific elected representatives. And that's why it's so important as an initial step to become informed and understand who represents you. And so while this is not a fail-safe measure in figuring that out, this is a really cool feature that Facebook has instituted despite problems with the platform itself historically. And they fixed it largely that it's pretty accurate. And so what it allows you to do is you can just search Town Hall when you're on Facebook logged into your profile, and it will use your location settings and pull up a list of who represents you. And as you can see, the top third or half of that screenshot on your right gives an example of who would represent a given constituent that resides in Boston. And so it goes all the way up from the local level to the federal level, but can be a great starting point for figuring out who represents you. Okay. And so briefly, I just want to show you that there's a lot of information out there on public websites, especially in the larger cities throughout the state, where you can find out some good tidbits of information about folks that might represent you. So Worcester, as the second largest city in the state, and where I happen to be from, is a good example in terms of what information is publicly available. This might not be the case, especially if you reside in a smaller town. You might have to do some more digging. But there is a lot to be found on city and municipal websites. Okay, so with that in mind, I want to talk a little bit about how we can use public records to become informed about the most up-to-date status of what's happening in your locality, and how to sort of develop some initial goals around what your advocacy campaign is going to be around. So as I said, I'm from Worcester. I love the Woo. I also went to Clark. I'm a Clarkie, if there's anybody out there in the audience. So I have great love for this city, and I think this example provides a really nice illustration of how nuanced discussions about equity and implementation and regulation can be. And so what you can see on the left is a screenshot, and I apologize that it's a bit hard to read, of some city councilor quotes from a recent article from the Telegram Gazette about discussions that have been happening at the city council level as to where to place possible cited establishments in the city. And so on your right, you have a map which shows in purple the proposed areas that have been offered by the city as where the preponderance of licenses for seated retail establishments will be as the legalization moves forward. And so as you can see, if you're familiar with Worcester, is that those purple areas tend to be concentrated in the main south area, which is in that lower left quadrant, and on the eastern part of the city, which tend to be disproportionately occupied by folks that are poorer and also tend to be Black and brown, rather than the western and northwestern part of the city. And so as a result, there's been a lot of conversations coming up about what this means about the future of cannabis policy in the city. And what I want to point out here, and I think it's important, is that issues related to racial equity and fairness come up at every step of the way. So both in cities and towns that have passed bans, that are passing moratoria, and even among those that have made the decision to move forward. Okay, so it's important to end that these equity issues don't stop even when a city has embraced legalization. And also, importantly, racial and economic justice issues are often not discussed explicitly, especially by politicians. Instead, I want you to know that geography is a common proxy that's used. So you'll often hear elected officials talking about certain parts of the city, and that is a very common way that race and poverty are discussed. So there's a lot of concern in Worcester that the distribution of these possible establishment licenses are not equal, and that they actually are more so distributed in certain areas of the city. And so you can see how nuanced it can be when you're trying to figure out, well, is this proposal equitable or it is not? And I think the point here is that you can't look at this map and know whether that is the case or not. It involves an extensive and involved understanding of what's happening at the local level, and some really thoughtful considerations. So for example, what extra support would the city be willing to give to retailers that were opening up in historically disadvantaged areas to help ensure that they succeed. What you do see, sort of in contrast to what Shalene was talking about, is some local reticence of creating access to retail establishments in traditionally disadvantaged areas because of the very real fear in some cases that those establishments will not help increase or enhance the image of these communities that are trying to pull themselves up from the drug war, as we saw with the Compton example. So the idea here is that it's really important that we're requiring and asking and obligating our local officials to be explicitly concerned and aware of these issues, and that we pose questions that demand responsible answers from our city government. So not only what support will be given to licensees should a map like this end up moving forward, but what other kind of community reinvestment and development initiatives might also be taking place consecutively to help buttress the potential success of these establishments? And importantly, in what specific ways will the city push against the stereotype and stigma of cannabis? So with these kinds of questions in mind, I now want to turn to Kamani, who's going to offer some further insights.
Awesome. Thank you, Sarah. So these are some considerations for envisioning and advocating for an equitable industry. Like Sarah was saying, there's still, unfortunately, a stigma of marijuana and fear being associated with the industry and the impacts on the community. So it's questions you should think about is like how to reasonably and ethically support growth in areas that have been disproportionately impacted by punitive drug policy. The most minimal restrictions on zoning as possible. The city of Northampton is allowing for a 200 feet buffer zone between establishments and where schools and where children typically congregate, versus the state level has the minimum requirement of 500 feet. So with allowing local levels, they're allowed to go below that. So it's great, again, because for communities of color and people from lower incomes, it would be much harder for them to apply it under the 500 feet. There's also technical assistance at the state level, and if local municipality, they can also put in technical assistance when crafting their policy, and also community reinvestment at the local level. So these are some of the early lessons we've seen at the local level when we're advocating for equity. Again, bringing it back to just combating that stereotype about cannabis and the industry in general, while also supporting local stakeholders and addressing their concerns, because you're getting people from all walks of life. Careful about just making assumptions about people who both are pro-cannabis and also vice versa against cannabis. We all come from different places. Use published and verifiable data or models where available to support arguments. We'll show some of those in some later slides. And it's important local equity programs and considerations. If they're not talking about it, you can just bring it to a certain elected official's attention and get that conversation going, which actually we're doing in Cambridge, which I'll show you in the next slide. So one of the city councilors is putting together a meeting on social equity through the Economic Development and University Relations Committee. The city councilor, the city of Cambridge, where I live, has been talking about how to zone and what type of policy they should have around recreational marijuana. But there's been a lot of questions. And when they're talking about zoning, there's been some city councilors who are concerned about just equity and some of the minority businesses and women-owned businesses in the city. And there's just been confusion around zoning. So one of the city councilors decided to take it upon herself and bring both me and Commissioner Title to this meeting just to talk about what social equity can look like in the city of Cambridge. And these are just some of the key initial steps. Once you had identified a stakeholder that you would want to meet with, what you should do next. You should just kind of find out the most, hold on one second, I can't fully read this. Oh, sorry. Is there a way to, yep, sorry. Excuse me, I haven't memorized everything. Just find out the most current news regarding cannabis regulations in your locality, or ban or moratorium. I usually use news sources, so I use Google a lot and just put the town and recreational marijuana, so Newton recreational marijuana, Cambridge recreational marijuana, and whatever comes up. That usually gives me a good idea of what's happening in the past recent weeks around cannabis policy. Determine a clear and concise goal for your campaign, given the status of regulations. It could start with just trying to stop a ban or trying to stop a moratorium, and then you can move from there. You should also reach out to other stakeholders to offer introductory calls or meetings to take a temperature on locality's position. Just do your research beforehand to have a sense of what to expect of each elected official. The planning board might have a different position versus the selectman or the city councilor. So hi, my name is Kamani. I'm with the MRCC. I explain a little bit about who we are, and I just jump right into it. Curious if the municipality is deciding on what their recreational marijuana policy will be, or what zoning is going to look like, and we usually take it from there. And then lastly, we identify and plan concrete action steps accordingly, and these should include a combination of public education aimed at a diverse public, so get as many stakeholders from different backgrounds as possible, and we'll jump at what that education campaign could look like. And also mobilization and messaging, again, targeting certain folks who will have influence over specific decision makers when deciding what zoning or recreational marijuana policy will look like in the town or city.
All right, so this is what I call EM2 because I just think it's helpful in thinking about how the cycle of these potential action steps might work synergistically. So as Kamani was talking about, we have this idea of public education. So we first need folks to understand what it is we need, what it is we want, and fundamentally what the problem is and how we can fix it. And then we need to mobilize folks. We need to get residents who are also invested in those same goals to come to the table and be engaged both virtually and literally and in every way possible. There's a key quote in advocacy literature that says that if you don't have a seat at the table, you are on the menu. So this is a very, very critical juncture point in any campaign that you try to get as many folks involved and as many people to show up as possible. Once you have amassed your troops, then you will need to engage in a targeting messaging campaign that is directed at those targets, usually those in power, those local officials and stakeholders that Kamani was talking about before. And then based on what ends up happening with that messaging, you might have to begin the cycle again and start educating folks anew, mobilizing anew, and messaging anew.
Yeah, Commissioner Tyler said earlier, like if you're not at the table, usually they're eating you. You're on the table. So something to think about for the future.
Yeah.
And yeah, these are just more examples of what Sarah was alluding to. Just community letters, writing, or other communication campaigns, newspaper op-eds, press, and media is very important for just getting your message out. Demonstrations in front of the State House, not too far from here. We've held a bunch of rallies when they delayed the law, when the House was talking about making it crazier. We just kept doing rallies and kept showing up with signs and making, just noise around what we believe in. Personal visits to elected officials and their aides is important. I meet with different city and town officials all the time. I was just in Ware in Western Massachusetts meeting with a member of the town planner. So just face-to-face is very useful. And testifying in front of committees when there was a joint committee on marijuana policy, or that they're still formed. They were having their meetings in the State House, showing up, having good testimonies, having good talking points, and making sure other people show up and do the same thing is very useful. And we're just going to jump into some more examples of how you can educate folks. So we use a term called framing, and framing is just about getting language that fits your worldview. It's not just your language. The idea is primary, and the language carries those ideas and invokes the idea. So we use this when a lot of the bans and moratoriums were happening across the state last year. Me and the other co-founders of MRCC decided to make like a really catchy way of just reminding people why they don't want to do that. So the top 5 reasons for recreational cannabis establishments in Massachusetts, we made a nice picture with cannabis kind of looking like the State House. And some of the 5 reasons included there's already an illicit market in the town. So if a lot of these folks think that banning will just stop cannabis from coming to their municipality, but we kind of have to remind them that it's already there. We also remind them that they can use some of these taxes to educate folks around what cannabis is and how to responsibly consume, and also youth prevention. Tax money can be used to helping people below the age of 21 from staying away from cannabis. Safe access is important. Just reminding folks that in the illicit market, some of these cultivators or producers tend not to test their product, and they just can sell you anything, so you don't know what you may or may not get. And then bring it back again to taxes and revenue. We slyly make jokes with some of these other town folks that, there's money being used for roads and for schools and for, fire trucks. So tax money can be used for things that can benefit the greater community. And then lastly, we always remind them that there's a local economy around legalization and how there can be potential entrepreneurs and residents who can become workers working for these new establishments that do come to the town. So we kind of had top 5 reasons and broke it down into smaller points that can be very useful when talking to the municipality. And the mayor of Holyoke, Alex Morris, has been super just proactive and super awesome about embracing cannabis in the city of Holyoke. Recently, he came out firmly saying that he wants cannabis cafes, social use licenses to come to the city. And he had a whole press release, he had a video, and there's a little ambiguity right now how social use will work in the state. But he's just like, I want it. What do we need to do? And I'm ready when the state will allow it. A year before that, in April of last year, he essentially was telling the press that he sees that the old city mills as a great place for members of the city and other small business owners to come and just revitalize what Holyoke can be. And even back in 2016, Alex Morris, the mayor, was one of the only mayors to come out and publicly express his support, openly express his support for Question 4. So there's a lot of trailblazing municipalities across the state that are embracing this, and a lot of elected officials in those towns and cities that do want an equitable cannabis industry to thrive in their city or town.
Yeah, so I think what's a really important point in advocacy too is that you always want to use real world examples wherever you can. So the hypothetical isn't going to get you that far. So what's really great about what's starting to happen in Massachusetts is these are really real and promising examples that you can point to when you're speaking to folks in your own localities about what's already happening and also what's already working. So just to piggyback of what Kamani was saying in terms of the great stuff that's starting to happen in Cambridge and in Holyoke, we have a great little case study emerging with Somerville as sort of emerging as a model area for some of this stuff as well. So they are, for example, planning on including economic empowerment and also the state-supported equity program when they're developing their local regulations, and they're doing that presently. And I know folks at MRCC and 3CRN are involved in some of that. And so they also plan on making provisions that are ensuring that local businesses are going to be able to operate and be sustainable in Somerville. And so I encourage you to use wherever there are real world examples and testimonies of stuff actually working and happening, not to reinvent the wheel or speak hypothetically, but to use very real examples that are happening in our state right now. And so beyond what we can do to educate folks, there's also some great examples coming out of Somerville as to how we might think about mobilizing one another in our particular towns and locations. So the first example I want to share from Somerville just shows a survey that was sent out to Somerville residents, which is really great because it's showing that the city itself is taking a lot of initiative to learn about what their residents want. But again, we're hearkening back to this idea, this adage that if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. If you don't have a seat at the table, you're on the menu. And so it's really important that we use all the channels that we possibly have to engage and mobilize diverse constituents that care about this topic. So that means using social media, also reaching out to people through a variety of means, whether it's flyering, whether it's doing cold calls, whether it's a host of other kind of ways that you try to engage and educate and mobilize folks to learn about an issue and also respond. So in this case, we would want as many folks as possible that we knew were engaged and invested in equitable cannabis policy in Somerville to fill out the survey that was sent by the city. And so a primary goal in any grassroots community effort is that you have as many people as possible show up for as much as possible. And this means often that the best thing that you can do is fill a room at a public meeting with as many people that are on your side as possible. And so try to remember whenever you're thinking about organizing an event to be, mindful that you want standing room only. You want to bring as many people into meetings as possible that share your vision. So this will come both in events that are organized by the city itself, so public meetings and hearings. You want as many people at those as possible, and also any events or demonstrations or rallies or meetings that you also schedule out of your own initiative.
Awesome. So yeah, there are definitely elected officials out there that will listen to you specifically around equity. I've actually worked with all these folks in the past. Aaron Vega out of Holyoke, again, Holyoke is just such an awesome city. He was proactive when the governor delayed the rollout of recreational marijuana here, and the Joint Committee on Marijuana Policy was formed. Aaron is on that joint committee. And he filed a bill, House Bill 3505, I still remember, that specifically would have allowed Black or Hispanic residents of the state to apply first or be a local resident for cultivation license. That eventually turned into what the economic empowerment and equity program we have here now. And I remember meeting with him talking about what that bill would look like. Councilor Siddiqui in Cambridge is actually the councilor that set up that committee hearing on social equity, and it was concerned after hearing some of the city councilors expressing that zoning, may not have the effects on equity, and she explicitly said that we should talk about how zoning will affect equity, because it definitely will. So she's being very proactive of having that meeting. George, the director of planning in Somerville, like Sarah was saying, he actually helped out with a lot of that survey and setting up those public meetings. One of our members at MRCC and a cultivator who's setting up a farmer co-op, Eric Schwartz, lives in Somerville and was very direct and proactive with the planning board. And I actually met Debbie, the city councilor of Malden, at a meeting like mid-April we did in Cambridge, just about educating folks on what the new regulations are. And she showed up asking a lot of questions, just wanting to know more about the equity in general and what the industry can look like in Malden. She's actually she's set up a study committee for the city of Malden that will specifically have residents who have expertise in local regulations, public health, and businesses and entrepreneurship. So again, all these folks, there are folks out there that want to have an equitable industry in their neck of the woods of the state. So definitely don't be afraid to reach out to folks.
Great, Clemmy. And so as we're about to wrap up, I just want to offer one additional resource that might be useful to you, and we will distribute this deck so that you have it. This is an exercise that I've used before in my own advocacy work, and I've used with my graduate students, and it's called a messaging box exercise. And this can be a really helpful starting point as you're trying to figure out what it is that you're actually going to be communicating, both as you're generating public education messages and also as you are attempting to target public officials. And so the messaging box activity is one that you can sort of fill out. And the idea is that there are 4 different kinds of messages that you can create for a given advocacy campaign. There's a value-based message that relates to what is the underlying value behind your issue. Obviously, we spent a lot of time today talking about equity. There's a barrier message. So that is sort of what oppositional message might prevent success. And it is important to note that this is not a message that you would necessarily share with targets in the local government, particularly if they're not supportive to your cause, but you would use it to support and rebut potential points that were made against the position that you have. You could also create what's known as a vision message. So that constitutes what kind of vision you might have for the world or society and how that supports the specific plan that you're trying to advance. And then finally, we get to the nitty gritty, which is your ask. What is it actually that you're asking? What is the goal of your campaign? And so I don't have a ton of time here to read through every one of these, but I want to provide you an example that you can look back at later that specifically references the cannabis industry and some of the topics that we've discussed today in the webinar. So basically, whenever you're doing this exercise, what you want to do is write out the value and the barrier and the vision and the ask that you have, and that's sort of in shorthand brainstorming and strategizing language. And then you want to go and draft sort of more marketable messages that would actually be on your deliverables. So like Kamani was talking about, would be on those 5 reasons not to ban kind of promotional materials that you would send out. So I'll just read off one example as an example of the value message that you would want to maybe necessarily think about communicating. So the value being that the government should protect equity provisions and right the wrongs of the drug war. And so you'd want to think about how you can express that in a really marketable and deliverable message. And so there's some example messages for each of the categories of messages below. And I find this to be a really useful and helpful exercise, especially at the beginning, just to sort of flesh out what it is you care about, why, and what ultimately you're asking that your local governments do. And so these are just some additional examples that you can read through as we pause on this slide that correspond with the different kinds of messages we talked about. So you just want to think about whenever you're ultimately getting to the messages that you deliver to targets, that you want them to be as catchy and punchy and clear as possible. You want to think about what makes it a really awesome headlining, grab your attention kind of message and go with that. So think of the best like Onion article headlines that you've ever read, but make them serious. The best New York Times article headlines you've ever read. The best Facebook posts that have gotten your attention. And think about how you can really engage folks in that way. And I briefly just want to end with a couple final principles. So as we've heard, there's different ways that this advocacy can play out. When we're thinking about what you might ask when you're delivering your messages to targets, there's 2 different ways that it can go largely. One is when you're trying to persuade someone, and that's about not making any concessions. So to go in and say, listen, it is absolutely imperative that we think about equity when we move forward with cannabis in Worcester. Another way that you can approach advocacy when you're delivering your messages is to be a bit more constrained and be thinking about negotiation. So this can help when you're talking about specific outcomes and measurable output. So for example, we want the buffer to be 200 rather than 500 feet. So in this case, you can think about having an initial position, which is likely asking more than you will receive, and then having a fallback position that you would ultimately be okay with. So you always want to ask for more than you think that you will get when you're negotiating, but it has to pass the laugh test, okay? Which means it has to be something that is reasonable and logical for most folks that would be hearing it. And the last thing I'll tell you about is what's known as the triangle offense. And this is just a quick strategy that's really helpful when you're giving written or spoken testimony of any kind. And the model you just want to remember that is say what you're going to say it, and say what you just said. And yes, it is that simple. It's so simple that it almost confuses you and can tongue tie you and brain tie you when you're thinking about it. But that is really as simple as it is. You just say what you're going to say. So I'm here to advocate for an equity program in Somerville. We need an equity program in Somerville. It's imperative to the success of the cannabis industry here. And I just indicated why I think it's important that we have equity provisions as we move forward. So this is just a very simple model for breaking down arguments that you might want to make when you're giving written and verbal testimony of different kinds. And lastly, we have some examples of really effective and wonderful persuasion efforts that in part use this triangle offense. And these are some examples from the great work that Marion and the other folks at 3CRN have worked on in the past year. So the link below includes some awesome examples of academic policy memos that were used in 3 specific cities, in Holyoke, Methuen, and Lawrence. To try to persuade local officials to move on cannabis and also to make sure that provisions were equitable. And so while they're city specific, they provide some great starting points for many grassroots efforts for how to think about framing and messaging, persuading, and also moving forward with any and all goals that you have. There are some great data points in here that I think are generally applicable across all localities. So we encourage you to check those out and not reinvent the wheel. And lastly, this is actually adopted from the syllabus of the class that I teach, in which graduate students have to put together a really comprehensive advocacy plan as their final assignment. But I find that these reflective questions are really, really useful to start with, to continue with, and to revisit at multiple points during a campaign. So this is not a single point reflective exercise that you should engage in, but one that you should do continuously as you're working on local advocacy. So you want to consider, what is my primary goal and what values does it correspond to? So that again connects to the messaging box exercise. What evidence and research and examples can I use to justify my position? So we've tried to arm you with some initial data points about racial inequity over the life of the drug war and how there is evidence that those will continue to persist in the context of legalization. We've also provided some examples of some really pioneering cities that are doing some really great work that you can lean on. Who can I count on to champion this cause? This might shift over time. This is not a static assessment, but Kamani's given some really great insights as to some initial folks that have really stepped up early on. Who can I expect to offer support or opposition? We know from what Shalene spoke about that the CCC is really in a position of support, but their hands are tied at the local level. So we need to find some local level support as well. And how can I attempt to manage or even convert those who initially oppose the cause? So you will expect and find that there is a lot of concern, and a lot of it is rationally based and based in some really unjust history about the criminalization of marijuana and other drugs in many communities. And so how can we use data, examples, and just persuasive techniques to try to mitigate some of that opposition? What will be my key campaign messages and how will I deliver them? We spoke about that in talking about the messaging box activities, some of the great examples Kamani provided as to what you want to include in messages and how to get those out. What will be my timeline? This is where getting public information is really important. As Shalene said, things are changing day by day and moment by moment. What will be my concrete action steps? Who will be my targets and how will each action step move the campaign forward? So I like to think in threes because I think it's helpful for short-term campaigns. So it's helpful to think about, will I attend X number of public hearings? I will attend every public hearing on this topic. I will blitz news media with a news story each week if I need to. I will ask for and conduct multiple in-person meetings with city officials. Those are examples of action steps that you might be able to articulate. And also how the power structures and processes in each local government might impact my campaign. So this is where you might have to also lean on champions and other stakeholders that are actually entrenched in the local government to gain a little insight about this if you're new to advocacy, but fear not, you can and you should endeavor to answer it and the rest of these questions as you begin your local advocacy work. So thank you so very much to everyone who joined in, to was able to stop by and listen to what we had to say today. We'd now like to open up, we have about 15 minutes left. I'd like to open up this webinar to any questions or comments and see if we might be able to broaden the discussion a bit and include all of you folks that have been listening and following along.
Great. So Marion and Ben from C3RN are looking at your questions. While we're doing that, I can underscore a couple of points that I think are wonderful that Sarah and Kamani raised. As a government official and a former activist, it has been really striking to me how underutilized I think the public records request process is. So it was really nice to see both of you bring that up. I think if you're trying to find out more information about what's going on in your city and town, that's something to take advantage of. I also want to bring up, for me, when I went to the Facebook Town Hall feature, my city councilors were not listed. They're not using it yet. But if you go to our city website and it lists the councilors, it's actually just their cell phone numbers. I was really surprised last year, and I was kind of intimidated because I didn't know anything about, local processes or, how to really like engage in that. But I just called the numbers and I said, can I talk to you about this upcoming, this bill and this upcoming legal marijuana program? And they were so nice about it and very open to hearing the most, basic information because they have so many different things going on. You don't necessarily have to know every single detail.
Yeah, those are great.
Yeah. So if you all have questions, just pop it in the question box, and I can read them out for the presenters. We just had some comments of great job and go Somerville, and one of the questions was also to have the PowerPoint available afterwards. So we will have the PowerPoint, we will have the video as well, and we will email you all, the information where to find that on the C3RN website, I assume on MRCC's, and we could also through here. So if anybody has any questions, pop them in. Let's see.
Can I make one more point?
Sure.
So, Kamani mentioned that in Malden, City Council President DeMaria had put together a study committee. I think that's a really good way to start if you feel like maybe you're not making any headway. A study committee is such a non-controversial thing to suggest, and if you have diverse perspectives on there, I think that's a really sincere, great way to get at good recommendations.
Yeah, I know other cities and towns are also doing like recreational marijuana committee. So if there's ongoing issues, even after they decide what zoning and policy should be, there's a committee, a dedicated committee that will always be talking about cannabis, even if the selectmen or the planning board decides that we're done with it. So something else to think about.
Great. All right, we got a question. Hi, we try and have town hall type meetings, but we don't get a lot of attendance if we don't have entertainment. Has this been a problem for anyone else? I'm curious as to what town you are and what type of, is that entertainment afterwards to lure people to the town hall to just come and participate? It's an interesting question.
Overall, it can be hard to get people to show up to town hall meetings. Sometimes they're during the week at like 3 o'clock or even 6 o'clock could be hard coming after work. So trying to get it scheduled at a reasonable hour, even if it's during the week, is super important. But it is difficult trying to get a lot of people to show up for town hall meetings.
Okay, so that was in Washington, D.C.
Oh, okay.
You tried weekends and weekdays.
I feel like the idea of entertainment is a really good one. I haven't seen that brought up a lot. I mean, usually you hear about pizza, right?
Yeah.
But I like the idea of entertainment.
I would also encourage folks, it's really easy to Google. If you aren't familiar, look up the 6 R's of participation. Those offer some really great suggestions as to what to consider when you're trying to mobilize folks. And if you can go through each of the R's, I've known that some folks have greater success when they do that. So that's one resource you might want to check out.
Great. So we've also got, thanks for supporting local equity. Anybody else have a question they want to ask?
The Economic Empowerment Priority Program is about priority, specifically. So the idea there under state law was that registered medical marijuana dispensaries would have their applications considered first, And the way I see it, this was about offsetting that. So other businesses that could show that they had demonstrated or would demonstrate economic empowerment in those communities would also get a head start. And we are alternating those review of applications. Now, if you're thinking about what sort of benefits will people from disproportionately harmed communities get, then you're thinking about the equity program. And so you want to keep an eye on the Cannabis Control Commission this month. That will be launching very soon. You'll be hearing from our new Community Outreach Director, Shakia Scott. So just keep an eye on the CCC, and you'll be hearing a lot more about the equity program.
It's coming.
Cool. All right, we have another question. How do we get small business departments of cities to support equity as they're federally funded?
That can be tough because of the federal funding, but just explaining to them that equity will allow more small businesses and more businesses from disproportionately harmed areas to come. I guess just using the same points that we brought up throughout the webinar, that equity allows more participation from the same people a small business department would represent.
Yeah, and I would also encourage you to look at some of the great stuff that's come out of Holyoke, specifically with Arian Vega. He has some really important and I think effective messaging about the importance of innovation in any area where you're trying to support business, and how the cannabis industry can work hand in hand with achieving those goals. So it's a good starting point.
All right, this is, we got another question. Sounds like it'll be out of state. So we don't have a rec adult use regulation. When doing outreach, what should the focus be on?
Sorry, can you say that one again?
We don't have a rec adult use regulation. When doing outreach, what should the focus be on?
I can start. I think that that's a good situation to be in, because you can sort of, as Kamani was explaining earlier, you can set the framing of what items are important. I would personally set the agenda at zoning to start, and then what are your local values that you're trying to push forward? Are you trying to get jobs for local residents, businesses for local residents? And yeah, set the agenda from there.
Yeah, zoning is important, and just making, I guess, whether you have land in mind or you don't, but making it as least restrictive zoning as possible, it works out for everyone involved in the cannabis industry. So yeah, zoning is the name of the game, is what I'm learning these last couple months.
Awesome. Yeah. All right, we got another one. What municipalities are on the fence that could really use help in understanding the new industry?
Every municipality. All 351 municipalities could use assistance understanding the regulations.
I would really, sorry.
Yeah.
I would really start with where you live, because that's where you're probably going to have the most power and the strongest voice.
Yeah, so I'll add just
question.
what you were saying in the great example of the cell phone numbers. It's great to target any and everyone you can, but I will tell you that an elected representative is going to take your call a lot faster if you live in their area than if you don't. And so I think the idea is that you want to try to influence your community to be the best that it possibly can to serve as a model, and to use information that you're getting as that advances to then distribute in a wider capacity to set forward as possible modeling that you can use for the rest of the state or for other areas that are on the fence. But you always want to start where your home is. That's a number one sort of rule in advocacy that will get you a lot further than trying to tackle every community in the state.
All right, we've got another question. Are there any Dorchester residents advocating for cannabis? Know anybody in Dorchester?
One of our co-founders, Joseph Gilmore, lives in Dorchester, is born and raised. I think there's a Dorchester economic empowerment applicant I've met recently. I can't remember her name off the top of my head, but yes.
Yeah, I can think of 5 or 6 off the top of my head. So there's definitely a community there you can connect with, maybe go through.
Yeah, please reach out to MRCC and we can put you in the right direction.
Great. How can we overturn a ban?
A lot of local community education, whether it's showing up to the public hearings when they're talking about the ban, having outside public meetings, education sessions, Moratoriums and bans have been flipped across the state, but it's a lot of just showing up and doing a lot of outreach in the town that's talking about banning.
Yeah, in my experience, it really helps to get your core group together before there's a hearing or referendum and talk about how you're going to, each of you is going to go out to your network and get more people that are ready. And that way, when the day comes and there's a hearing or a referendum, like, boom, you're ready to go.
Yep.
Cool. We have another one. How would you respond to the stone driving concerns at the community level, at a local city council?
I think it's the same as at any level. I mean, it's the same concern. And the issue there is that we need to find a way, and we are finding a way to test and minimize impaired driving. There's a commission at the state level. There's a push to collect data that can give us more information on how much is impaired driving happening and how can we try and minimize that. So I don't think it matters what level. I think it's a really important concern whether marijuana is legal or not.
Right. It just comes back to research, education. I feel like we don't know enough about cannabis to determine what is considered impaired stone driving. So it needs to come back to just collecting as much data as possible. And for now, telling people they shouldn't do it because we don't have enough information.
And this is just another side plug too, just to make sure that as you're advocating, I mean, a lot of this rests on the availability of good and credible data, which cannot be done without funding research. So as things are developing at the local level, I think you always want to keep in mind that the extent to which you can also be advocating for research infrastructure in your local area is really important, because without funding that kind of activity, we're not going to end up getting to the point of having objective data to draw more specific policy parameters around, for example, when thinking about stone driving.
Yeah, and I'll jump in here too. Yeah, and I also think some of the work that we have done at the local level is to assure the local level towns and municipalities that the state is also on the case for it, and so that they don't need to necessarily repeat the wheel, but to follow guidance and things that will come out of the state level.
I wonder if, because that just reminded me, you hear some of the same concerns over and over. Will this cause stone driving? Will this cause our property values to decrease?
Youth prevention.
Youth prevention, yeah. Maybe we can do like a one-pager with just like quick answers as to what the evidence is, because in short, there's no evidence that any of those consequences are caused by dispensaries in a town.
Yep.
In fact, property values.
I encourage folks too to use that, the messaging box where the opposition message is. If you get that list from us and it doesn't seem wholly inclusive of what you've experienced in terms of oppositional messages, share those with us so that we can incorporate them into the resources that we share with data pointing you to or how you can rebut oppositional messaging as well.
Yep. Awesome. Let's see. There's a question about advocates in Bristol County. So I think it's a common need that people want to find advocates around their own towns. So right now the MRCC is a great resource in trying to coordinate all that.
Yeah, we've set up like Facebook groups, and we have a consumer advocacy program where we're trying to have advocates all across the Commonwealth. So we've been to Bristol County and like the South Coast and done some work out there. So please feel free to message us, shoot us an email, and someone in that area is definitely doing some advocacy work out there.
Cool. So there's a couple of questions about, will the slides be available? And yes, they will. Mm-hmm. And there's one question, can they use this presentation at any meeting? Which I actually think, yes, of course. Sure. If you're advocating at the local level, this is important information.
Absolutely.
So feel free. We'll be sending.
We will send them off, and that sounds great to me.
Awesome. Let's see. There's anything else? Sorry, one second.
While you're doing that, on the questions about are there any advocates in such and such city, I think A, yes, connect with all these organizations, but B, talk to your own friends at network and family and
Be the
make them the advocate.
advocate. Become the advocate.
Yeah, this is part of parcel of what we're talking about in terms of mobilization. So it's great to have resources like MRCC to rely on, but the more that we can buttress those available resources that already exist, the better chance you have of your campaign succeeding. So it's as simple as a Facebook post. Hey, does anybody care about this? Often also, there'll be people that have personal stories with cannabis, folks that have used it medicinally and really believe in it because of that. When you hear about those things in your community, have those conversations and make the bridge between personal use stories and testimonials that people share in their personal lives and how those might be used at a local level to campaign for policy change.
Cool. Thank you. All right, we have one last question in the last minute. And I've heard this. I've been asked this myself a couple of times. Is there any way to attain negotiated host agreements?
Yeah, I think they're available online. I know Lowell just put out a draft host community agreement. So if you go to Lowell's city website, you should be able to find them. And then there's also a couple, I think, medical host community agreements that are available from the past.
Yeah, you can search on DPH website and find medical host agreements. And so I wonder,
like, hopefully recreational will slowly roll out.
Yeah, I have a bunch that are public, but I think they're medical. But if one of your organizations wants to, take the links and put them together, I'd be happy to help.
Sure.
Yeah, I can share I have the Lowell one of the draft one I'm thinking about using, so I can send that out. Please reach out to MRCC and we can provide that public host community agreement.
It's a great question.
Yeah, it's very important.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you all, and thanks to our expert speakers. I really appreciate the time and the thoughtfulness in putting together this presentation. So, thank you all.
Thank you.